Everyone sees this? Okay, so basically, hello. I am going to discuss how the concept of the self has been changed by the transition from what we might label tools technology to systems technology. This framework that I'm using is basically comes from Ivan Illich. I'm going to put a little bit of a spin on it, but we'll get there when we get there. So I'm basically going to claim that social media has not created any new ideas about the self as a concept, but rather has been a platform where this new self has been embodied and expressed. I am then going to discuss what I see as the dangers of social media in its current form, especially as we think of social media. When we think of social media, we usually think of social media in terms of its present industrial form, which is also kind of a term I'm going to be taking from Illich, and then distinguish between social media and digital spaces and propose for the creation of systems of conviviality. So basically, I'm going to define the age of systems and the system of body itself, social media potentially as parasitic, and then discuss systems for conviviality, excuse me. So basically, Illich, this line of research started earlier than this idea. So Illich wrote a book called Tools for Conviviality, where he investigated what he called the deep structures of tools. He basically argued that industrial tools needed to be replaced by what he labeled as convivial tools. Industrial tools are tools in an industrial society, and industrial societies define satisfaction as acquiring, and in quotes, Illich's quote, the maximum number of the largest number of goods, and is a society led by a professional elite. A convivial society is one that defines satisfaction in terms of autonomy and personal creativity. It is a society where people can pursue convivial work. Later on, close to his death, he was interviewed for a book called The Rivers North of the Future, where he expresses that he had actually made a mistake in this book. And his mistake was that he assumed that our concept of tool use and technology has remained static through all of history. His subsequent research led him to believe that our concept of tool use has changed over history, and he identifies roughly 3 eras of tool concepts. The pre-technological epoch, which is what I'm going to call it. He didn't really discuss that one too much, and then the technological epoch and the systems epoch. So in the pre-technological epoch, tools are not conceptualized as separate things from the user when they are being used. He uses the example of a pencil, saying basically that when a hand picks up a pencil in this epoch, the hand and the pencil are basically seen as the same entity performing a single task. The hand alone is a different object from the hand that uses the pencil. Or sorry, no, the hand alone is a different object from the object of the hand with the pencil, excuse me. In the 12th century, tools came to be seen as something separate from its user. He says that the 12th century is when this shift to the technological epoch happens. So the hand that uses the hammer is now conceptualized as being something different from the hammer. A person can use the hammer, walk away from it. While it's being used, the person is seen as something different. There's a whole thing he has with Aristotle's causes that I don't have time to get into of where he thinks this concept comes from, but that's basically the tools epoch. You have people and then you have tools. And then the third epoch, the systems epoch, is our epoch. So in it, we live with technology that we have a fundamentally different relationship to than our relationship to the hammer. Illich claims that when he uses a computer, when he manages a computer, he becomes a part of the computer. So this is a quote from The Rivers North of the Future. He says, "A hammer, I can take it or leave it. It doesn't make me into part of the hammer. The hammer remains an instrument of the person, not the system. In a system, the user, the manager, logically, by the logic of the system, becomes part of that system. A computer sustains itself as part of an informational network." So he wants to make clear as well, this is not a return to this old era where the hand and the pencil were seen as a single object. This is something new because the computer is something fundamentally different from a pencil or a hammer. He claims that under the logic of systems, we become a part of the system, and that the user must be using the system in order for a system to sustain itself. This epoch, he thinks, started in full around the 80s, but he found expression in the ideas of the systems epochs in Alan Turing, so much, much earlier. So Illich claims that in this new epoch, there have been changes in our concept of the self, as the technology of this epoch has been so all-encompassing that how we relate to one another has been altered by it. So the self in of the technological epoch is mathematical or an ideological structure rather than an entity given by its own mind, body, or soul. And I actually think that there's some evidence for this shift in our view of the self in contemporary Anglo-American philosophical scholarship, and this is going to be a huge gloss because of the time limit, but basically there's been an increase in popularity, especially over the last 50 years, in externalist theories of many areas, from mind, language, to feminist theory. For instance, Natalie Stoljar has a view of autonomy that she characterizes as being externalist, which in that it claims that autonomy must be understood from a broader social perspective, and she contrasts this with internalist theories, which view autonomy only from the view of the individual level. So, where's this all going? So while Illich expressed himself as being against the development of this new self, which is almost disembodied from the body and somewhat embodied in the system it is part of, I really don't think there's anything to really be against in this change, simply because this happens to be the world that we live in now. I mean, we're all here on Zoom today. I'm not boycotting the move to digital. In fact, I'm pretty sure we're all thankful we had it during COVID. So there's really no going back, and we have to figure out how to live in this new world of technology. So what I'm going to propose then, the little twist on Illich's later work, is that instead of thinking about tools for conviviality, I suggest that we should think about creating systems of conviviality. A system of conviviality is basically a system that users build themselves that aligns with their own goals. It is in some sense a bottom-up system in that it is built by users with a desire for autonomy and creativity, as opposed to industrial systems which are top-down, which only have the goal of basically making money for shareholders, which is basically social media in its current form. So one of the biggest ways the system self is even expressed and even live is through social media. But social media itself has been but social media itself has somewhat been parasitic upon these new digital spaces that emerge. And I want to be very clear here that we need to distinguish, I think, between digital spaces and social media. Yesterday there was a presentation on sacred spaces and Afro-Caribbean sacred spaces. Sacred spaces are actually also a conversation in indigenous spaces as well. And in some ways, I find these to be interesting examples, perhaps, of systems of conviviality, in that they are kind of these digital spaces that are created by people for their own community, for their own sense of creativity, for their own autonomy, and how they use that. However, these spaces in general are being made upon these large industrial social media platforms. So yeah, they're, excuse me. So the logic of most social media is that it's completely indifferent to what it is being used for. There is no social issue that is good for social media platforms, and user autonomy is certainly not one of the goals of people who make these things. For every attempt at creating an autonomous system on these technologies, there is a creation of spaces that support hierarchy and less personal autonomy. Alt-right spaces that encourage the systems of oppression that already exist on their world thrive on these social media platforms, for instance. The only thing that benefits social media company is more data. Just more data that is being sent. So indeed, these companies thrive on conflict even within their own space. While some people might make convivial systems among their own group on social media, it's still the case that they are building these systems on platforms that are profiting off of their very real social structures. And the only reason that companies like Facebook and Twitter exist is to make money for shareholders. So Cambridge Analytica aside, we might think of Mark Zuckerberg. If any of you have read the New Yorker profile on him, this is a guy who idealizes Augustus. So this is a guy that is not too concerned with the autonomy of the users of his system, especially if that's who he's going to pick as his hero. So now, is there anything to be said about how convivial systems might exist in our world? Well, Well, while Illich in Tools for Conviviality resisted calls for the specifics of what a convivial society might look like, I think we can point to discussions that have fallen under the label of digital sovereignty as promising directions. So digital sovereignty covers discussions of who should have control over data in digital spaces. So right now, social media companies and Google obviously have massive controls over our data. They sell it for a lot of money, and they also have control over our digital assets and the codes and programs that we use every day to create our digital societies. So one example of a positive development, I think, in this area would be the free software movement, which advocates for allowing users the freedom to use, create, and alter programs for their own use. That is, it promotes creation and development of more free software that can be used and distributed. Indeed, Richard Stallman, one of the founders of the movement, wrote a paper where he argued that that software should not even have owners. And that writing software, the whole structure of how we actually use software is something that should be altered away from a more industrial structure. Now, obviously, he started the free software movement long before the age of social media, and this is a very different construct from the kind of software that he was thinking of. However, I still think the fact that movements like this are around point to the fact that the possibility of being conscious and creating convivial systems, there are directions going towards creating these things. So in conclusion, basically what I want to say is that it was never inevitable that industrial social media ended up being the medium where the system self was expressed, and it has become difficult to see how digital spaces might exist on any platform except industrial social media, but I should suggest that what should be aimed for is the creation instead of convivial social media. So that is my presentation.